So I'm Tremaine, and I'm the Head of Emerging Technology at Northampton General Hospital. Head of Emerging Technology is obviously not a role you hear every day, so I get to obviously get to play around with automations and AI. It's a bit more serious than that, but get to explore how we can use technologies to deliver better care. So I'm going to go through sort of our journey with automation, the things that we've learned, and what kind of this meant during COVID. So, as Tony's covered, the world has changed. So, starting with sort of how we got into this. So, in March 2020, I think if with hindsight, being a beautiful thing, automation was something that was needed pre-COVID, and COVID meant that actually this is something that's something that's even greater importance. So in March 2020, we started our journey by I remember it being quite an interesting one where we had an urgent use case to look at oxygen monitoring. So like lots of other NHS organisations, oxygen supplies were something that was being carefully monitored, and a few trusts had issues. So we were going to get somebody to go and log in every hour 24/7 to capture data on the tank readings, and we're sort of like, actually that's I thought perfect example for where we can use an automation. So the challenge was, the deadline obviously for that was more like, yeah, can you do it yesterday please? And we hadn't had any sort of automation capability before. And by the end of the day, we had an environment set up, and we built a basic automation because it wasn't a complex automation needed, which kind of demonstrates that this isn't something that is needs to be sort of super complicated. It is something that you can get started with pretty quickly. So for us, that kind of grew organizational confidence because we'd developed in front of the organization. So everyone was around sort of looking at that. There was a bit of misconception, people expecting to see robots walking through the corridors doing tasks, which I'll kind of touch on how we did some of the sort of education around this. But for us, it meant that effectively we could repurpose time, and it gave us confidence to explore explore this technology in a different way. And clearly, during with COVID and backlogs and lots of sort of demand, we needed to scale. So we'd started to scale up the what we were doing. So we had pulled in some business analysts, trained people on using automation, and started to look across the organisation where are the sort of key points that we could apply this. So as you can imagine, one of the key pain points was around onboarding. We had to have a lot more staff. How do we do that? How do we do that quickly? So there was lots of sort of bottlenecks where we could apply automation there, and we could build sort of simple automations, and we got good at that, but needed to sort of scale further. And I'll kind of touch on some of the sort of automations that we're now sort of looking at and sort of we've grown into. So I think one of the challenges we had, and I kind of joke about this, is we had to grow pretty quickly working. So we received some funding from NHSX because clearly there was a sort of national need for this technology, and worked to identify opportunities that could be spread across those organisations. Speed of 3 months to do that was quite is quite significant, and as you can see, I had my first grey hair during that time, which was not an achievement I wanted, but it meant for us that we could start exploring, actually, is there commonality in processes? So in lots of organisations, I mean in most, you have complex environments, and the NHS is one where different organisations that are trying to come together, when you look at the processes, everyone does it slightly differently with slightly different systems. So trying to find commonality was a challenge, and we found areas, but there's it's something that's constantly being worked on, and how we can sort of scale and share automations. And now we've kind of gone pretty far ahead, and I won't touch too much on this, but we're now sort of working with 30 plus organizations. So I think interestingly, the sort of intelligent automation piece is one part of the puzzle. But looking at sort of emerging technology, it's sort of interesting how now we can add, adding machine learning and other sort of cool things into the mix. You can enhance automation significantly. So we're sort of finding that now we're moving into a world where there are endless options for technology, and it can really transform the way patient care is delivered. So especially now with a backlog from not being able to see patients during COVID, it's important to see how we can use this technology to help and to sort of free up, especially with automation, to free up time to basically focus on being human, and that's no more important than in healthcare. So the benefits, and this is more sort of showing the benefits that we've had. So for us, it's meant that one, increased staff morale. So there's a lot of fear that you hear around, and the Terminator did not help with that in terms of an image when you start thinking about robotic process automation. But the bit that's interesting is when you sit down with staff and say, how can we make your life easier? How can we take some of these tasks that you're doing that actually you'd rather not do? How can we hand them to an automation, and what would you do? And often the response is, oh, well, actually, we'd be able to spend more time being proactive, and it often translates into more time for patients. And as mentioned already, like the NHS does not necessarily, there is workforce challenges across the NHS. So it's key to free up as much time as possible for clinicians. Improved data quality is like a massive one that we've used automation for. So there's lots of legacy sort of information databases, all of that side of things that we need to update, and also things like record merging we do now with automation. So we have our pathology system, there's sort of 300 exceptions or so that come in each day that need or basically the data checking, and we can use automation to do that, again freeing up staff. So for us, some of the things that we're looking at the moment, let's just give you a flavour of it. So in healthcare, there's at the moment the elective recovery is a huge area. So we're sort of looking at how can we help with sort of appointment booking and rebooking. So often there's sort of teams that are doing that manually. So using automation for that. Areas around booking of tests, supporting with referrals, booking treatments, and doing some of the tasks that the clinicians, that typically do, but actually we can free up time to focus on other bits. So reducing that sort of admin burden. So what's interesting is obviously this can be applied across the whole sort of estate, as it were. So we found that it's as useful to finance as it is to clinicians. I shouldn't really say this isn't the most exciting automation, but I'm sure it is. So we're referencing sort of invoice queries, helping with staff onboarding, and merging records is one of the key things we've been doing at the moment. And there's sort of like your standard stuff around staff onboarding. So actually just generating when someone starts, not having someone manually do that is really helpful. Using automation to quickly get people into the organisation and started is really critical. And one of these are now not so much in development, but but three sort of interesting use cases to kind of share. So one is around sort of antenatal care screening, and this is where we use looking at a machine learning model. And this was something I sort of say stole, but I was inspired by an organisation in the US doing this, where they looked at the expectant mothers to be in terms of when they signed up to the service, and looked at the risk to those mothers to be, and booked them into the relevant clinic quickly and to the right clinician effectively. And what they found is that reduced the sort of harm to those expectant mothers to be. So we're building that model at the moment, which is exciting. The disciplinary equality one is kind of a automation for good piece. So one of the interesting things is you never really say can you use automation to tackle equality. Isn't something that's typically bandied about, but one of the things we saw was that in the NHS, there's national data around showing that staff from BAME backgrounds are more likely to go through the disciplinary process, and that's sort of a national trend. And the process is the important part in that. So what we have done is build automation that will go and check and reference the staff record, and can go off and will go and do that, and be able to escalate that to a senior HR manager to basically close it down as soon as possible and help reduce any inappropriate disciplinary procedures. So there's interesting use cases across the piece that aren't just about sort of like improving efficiency and time, but actually experience and things like patient safety as well. So as I mentioned, and this, when I first had this slide from our team before, I remember sort of going, what's this all about? But actually it became more and more clear to us that this was really an important area around sort of how we position the programme. So what we found is if we start talking to people in the organisation saying, can we come along and install a bot for you, use that sort of terminology, it wouldn't necessarily get the buy-in we wanted. So we had to think around how do we talk about automation, how do we encourage people to use automation, and where we landed was sort of having a adoption centre. So sort of thinking adoption, all things fluffy, cats, dogs, that side of things. So each of our automations we give a face to, we humanise, we give them a CV and a business card, and it kind of tells you what it will do and how it will interact. And what that's helped us with is, because it's visualised what effectively is going on in the background, one, more people come forward and say, actually, can we have an automation? Two, they appreciate this. People appreciate automations in a slightly different way. So when you sort of personified it a bit, people are sort of going, oh, thank you, responding happy that automation is there. It's part of the team. And as mentioned, there are organisations now with more digital workers than actual workers, because there's just so much there to do. And we've built and this is sort of a separate piece, but we've built a sort of community hub to kind of share this across the NHS. And I think this is one of the challenges in organisations, is sort of sharing this knowledge and information. And that's one thing we've done. So in terms of what we're looking at now and some of our vision, so we're sort of growing to try and encourage as much sort of cross-platform reusability as possible. So sort of sharing all the documentation across our organisations, having sharing as a standard, aligning development so that we're building things once for all where possible and avoiding that duplication, sharing licensing, setting sort of clinical standards, and sort of sharing training and events. So for us, it's been a really interesting and exciting journey with automation, and it's just at the start, really. There's so much potential, especially in healthcare and lots of different areas. So I'll stop there and take questions later on. But thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Tremaine. Really interesting story, I think, and particularly because of the opportunities, not just in driving efficiency, but the kind of patient care angle is really key. And something else you introduced there, this idea of using automation to tackle equality issues, I think is quite a good segue into some of the topics that Will's going to talk about.